The last time I was here, I started who knows what kind of a series. When I start a series of sermons, I never know where it's going to end, so I have no idea how long this one may turn out to be. I started a series of sermons on Palestine, and I asked the question, who owns Palestine, really? Because that's what a lot of the argument seems to be about now. You would get the impression, since people are talking about land for peace, that real estate's the issue, and that what we're fighting over down there is real estate. Now, I think what we are fighting about over down there goes so far back that hardly anyone remembers what they're fighting for down there. The hatreds are old, and I think they are so deep that no one really knows why they hate each other as much as they do. But there are real estate issues at stake, and the question is, who does this blood-soaked land belong to down there? Because that's what a lot of them have been making issues about. It's an important question, because the whole world seems to realize that the last chapter of man's troubled history will be played out on the stage of the Middle East, in Palestine. That's why the whole world cares so much about what would otherwise be an irrelevant, regional conflict. The same fights going on somewhere in East Africa would not generate the interest that this fight does in Palestine. And it's why also so many people turn to the Bible looking for the prophecies of the end time to see if they can tease out an answer about what's going to happen next. What's the order of events? When's this going to happen? Who's going to do what to who, and when are they going to do it, and why are they going to do it? The problem is, as I pointed out last time, it's not so easy to identify the players. Who are these people? What are their claims to this ancient land? If you don't know who the people are, and you don't know where they live, and you don't have any idea of these things, when you read through the prophecies that talk about these people, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, you're really not going to know very much about what they're talking about. Now, we know that the whole parcel of land from the Nile River to the Euphrates River, which includes all, half of Egypt, most of Iraq, as a matter of fact, and everything in between there, was all given and comprises a giant land grant given to a man named Abraham. And what we found a little more difficult is trying to follow the distribution of Abraham's estate among his descendants. We know that the Arabian Peninsula was granted to Ishmael, the son of Abraham, by Hagar, and that they are the Arabs today. We know that in generations following, the sons of Lot, Abraham's nephew, settled on the area on the other side of the Dead Sea. In all the Bible maps of that period of time, you probably have some in the back of your Bible you may want to refer to as you go along. All of them, with varying errors, will show, generally speaking, Moab and Ammon and Edom on the other side of the Dead Sea and to the south. We know that Isaac's older son Esau settled south of Moab and Ammon. But if we're going to do a title search on the land, what kind of a claim could these people make to the land they settled on was one of the questions we asked. And after the sermon last week, 2 weeks ago, we were asking this question, what about Moab and Ammon? They're just nephews of Lot. They're not direct descendants. They would not normally be entitled to a part of Abraham's estate. But Abraham and Lot were almost like family, and these two boys, who were sons of an incestuous relationship, still were relatives of Abraham, and they settled firmly, ensconced on the other side of Jordan, at least as squatters. What right, what claim of possession do they have to the land? We were talking about that. Now, if you check the maps in the back of your Bible, you'll see that Ammon, Moab, and Edom, you'll find them on the other side of the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea. The maps may be correct as to settlements at different times, but they are wrong, generally speaking, as to the deeds to the land. They have a rough look at it, but some of the maps, for example, show Ammon, where the city of Amman is today. And while that is true as far as squatters' rights are concerned, it's not true as far as ancient rights are concerned. There are 3 statements in the book of Deuteronomy, the 2nd chapter of Deuteronomy, that make important declarations relative to the ancient rights to this land. And the last time we talked about this, we had not completed the title search, because this particular passage of Scripture is a very important part of the record of title to these lands that are under dispute. Deuteronomy, actually there are 3 statements there that we have to consider. They come from a speech delivered by Moses near the end of his life. He rehearses the journey by which they had come to the place where they were ready to take the land of Canaan, and he summarizes what they had done, where they had gone, and in the process, he gives evidence of the land rights of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Deuteronomy 2, verse 1. Moses is speaking. Then we turned and took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spoke to me. And we compassed Mount Seir many days. And the Lord spoke to me, saying, you've been around this mountain long enough. I want you to turn north. Now, if you're looking for Mount Seir in the back of your Bible, you may or may not find it. What you probably will find is Petra. And Mount Seir is, the range of mountains in which you find Petra is generally called Mount Seir. He says, you are to pass through the coasts of your brethren, the children of Esau, who is Edom, who dwell in Seir, and they shall be afraid of you. Take good heed to yourselves, therefore. I want you to be especially careful going up through this area, which is the area of Petra, Mount Seir, where the sons of Esau lived. Meddle not with them, for I will not give you of their land so much as a footbreadth, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau for a possession. So guess who owns Petra and who has the rights to that country? The sons of Edom, or Esau, have the right to that country. It's in the record. You can buy of them food for money that you may eat. You can buy water of them for money that you may drink. Now, most Bible atlases and some maps in your Bible will show the location of Mount Seir. And as I say, you'll find Petra. In any case, you have found the general area where Edom is. Later in verse 8, and when we passed from our brethren, the children of Esau that dwelt in Seir, we made our way up through the valley. We came from the plain of Elath, from Ezion-Geber. We turned and passed by the way of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said, don't distress the Moabites. Don't contend with them in battle. Do not fight the Moabites. I will not give you of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for a possession. So bingo, now we know that the sons of Lot, Moab and Ammon, were given a region just north of Mount Seir for a possession. Their land was on the other side of the Rift Valley that comes from really the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, and then continues on south to the Gulf. This particular area, Edom basically was on both sides and straddled that valley far to the south. Moab is directly north of Edom, really on the other side of the Red Sea, the Dead Sea, and then we have Ammon just to the north of Moab in most of your Bible atlases. The descriptions are not quite as distinct and clear in that as they might otherwise be. He said the children of Lot are Moab and Ammon. And Ar, you'll find in some maps, most maps do not have it, is just north of Seir and the Edomites. Now there follows quite a discussion of the different giants that were in this land that had been dispossessed by the children of Lot. And I won't bother reading all of that, although it is of some interest as to what was going on in the land. The Lord spoke to me, saying, you are to pass over Ar through the coast of Moab this day. And when you come over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them, for I will not give you of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I have given it to the children of Lot for a possession. Now this is important. Moab and Ammon were not descendants of Abraham. They were sons of Abraham's nephew Lot from an incestuous relationship with his two daughters, you will recall. One could presume, Israel might have presumed, that these people were squatters. They had no right to the land. They were not children of Abraham, and they had the right to run them out. God says, no way. And says, I have deeded this land, as it were, to Moab and Ammon. Leave them alone. This is important. Now, one could presume that they were squatters, but if that had been so, it wasn't any longer. God has given them a grant of the land across the Jordan River, but also south of the river Arnon. Now, you will see, perhaps not named, but if you take a look at your maps in the Bible, there is a river that enters the Dead Sea about midway up on the east side. That is the river Arnon. There's another branch off of it, and I forget the name of the branch off of Arnon that joins it, and then the two of them flow together into the Dead Sea from the east side. Now, this land that was given to these people was all south of that river that's there. This is important to know in laying out the boundaries of the land that we're going to be looking at. And it's important to know as you go along in discussing the events that take place prophetically as you come down even to the time of the end on these people in these lands. Now, it's all important. The people of the Middle East are composed of the Ishmaelite Arabs, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Israelis. Now, these are the people, I should say, these aren't just the people of the Middle East, but these are the people of the Middle East who have a claim on the land. No one else has a claim on that land, and no one but the Israelis can make any ancient claim to the original land grant for Palestine, as we call it today. Because Palestine, well, we'll see what Palestine is, frankly, as we go along. Rise up, take your journey, and pass over the river Arnon. Okay, we've made our way from the south all the way up through Edom, Moab, now Ammon, and we've come to the river Arnon. Behold, I have given into your hand Sihon, the Amorite king of Heshbon, and his land. Begin to possess it and contend with him in battle. So when we cross the Arnon, that is the area where we will now begin to fight, if necessary, against the people who are there and begin to take that land for a possession. From the river Arnon north, the land of Israel, therefore, begins. We have already located the river Arnon for you. Now this begins what's called the land of the Amorites. God made Abraham's descendants, if you will recall, wait 400 years to possess this land. Because, as God put it, the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. I presume that the Amorites, who are Canaanites, settled there out of the original migrations that left away from Mesopotamia after the Tower of Babel, the confusion of the languages, and as people began to scatter out in different directions. The Canaanites went west, and the Canaanites, by and large, settled in what's called the Fertile Crescent along the coast of the Mediterranean. That's where they were. Now, when God gave Abraham this land grant that many, many years before, he also told him, as I mentioned before, that in any type of real estate deal, you have got not merely the contract which gives you ownership, that also there is a matter in the contract of the time of possession or date of possession of the land or the property. And sometimes the date of possession is not the same as the date the ownership comes over to you. Well, in this case, it was going to be 400 years between the time when God entered into the deed of covenant, signed the covenant, as it were, made the deal with Abraham that this would all be his land. There were going to be 400 years that would pass before he would be allowed to possess it. And the reason God gave for that was, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Now, the way I take that is that these people did have, in a manner of speaking, squatters' rights to this property. And at this point in their history, there was insufficient reason for God to discommode them, for him to push them out of the land, for him to destroy them as a people. But God, seeing the direction in which their society was going, knew that the time would come when their society would have decayed to the point where something definitely needed to be done. And it would be only when they had really so defiled themselves and so defiled the land that they could not be left there any longer, that God would finally give possession of the land to Israel. And it would be 400 years. And that's where we have come to when he says we're going to pass over the river Arnon to the north. The Amorites had settled this land a long time before, but they had no divine land grant. God was not going to dispossess them, though, until their iniquity demanded it. And the people can become so evil that their iniquity demands that action be taken. The classic example of that in the Old Testament is what city? Sodom. Everybody knows that one. And we all know that the iniquity of a given place on the face of the earth can become so bad that all that's really left is to cauterize the wound. You have to cut the boil out, cauterize the wound, cleanse it completely in order to see to it that this never occurs again. At least this one is over with and done. Now God says in verse 25 in Deuteronomy 2, this day I'll begin to put the dread of you and the fear of you upon all the nations under the whole heaven. They're going to hear reports of you. They're going to tremble because of you. They're going to shake. So I sent messengers out of the wilderness of Kedemoth to the Sihon, the king of Heshbon, words of peace. Now this is really interesting because in spite of what God told them to do, Moses sent him words of peace. He said, let me pass through your land this way. He offered him the same deal that was given to the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites. I will neither turn to the right hand or the left. You will sell me food for money that I can eat. You will give me water for money that I may drink. Only I will pass through on my feet. Now, just like the children of Esau and Seir, the Moabites that dwell in Ar, did to me, they'll do this all until I pass over Jordan into the land which the Lord our God gives us. He actually offered these people, these Amorites, the deal that if you'll sell us food, water, and let us pass through on our feet, we will cross Canaan and we won't bother you people. We won't do anything until we cross Canaan. But Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass, for the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, that he might deliver him into your hand, as appears this day. Now we can wonder to our heart's content about what was going on in this, but it is interesting that the deal was offered. The deal was rejected. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have begun to give Sihon and his land before you. Start possessing it so you can inherit this land. So he came out to fight against us, he and all his people, to fight at Jahaz. And the Lord our God delivered him before us, and we smote him and his sons and all his people. And we took all his cities at that time and utterly destroyed the men, the women, and the little ones of every city. We left none to remain. Now that's tough. It's really tough. It's one of the things that tends to turn people off when they read the Old Testament. They read all about God, they come to something like this, and they just can't handle it. But here it is. There it is right on the page of your book. It's there to be dealt with. I think there are a few hints in the modern world that we can look at, think about, and maybe begin to understand. I don't think we can fully understand. In Africa, for example, AIDS is decimating the population down there and leaving literally millions. I think the number now of orphans in Africa from AIDS is approaching 10 million, isn't it? I think I read that, and I did a program on it some time ago, and the number's probably gone up since then. But you think in terms of millions of children now who are being left orphans, no mother, no father, because of the AIDS virus sweeping through their country. And many of these children also have AIDS. Where would you start to correct that? How would you begin to turn the clock back on that? How would you eradicate this disease, this terrible disease epidemic sweeping the continent of Africa? Where do you stop it? As I pointed out not some time ago in a sermon, that what Africa needs is a good dose of the old covenant, where someone comes in and begins to enforce the Mosaic law on them. These things wouldn't have happened, but now the cat's out of the bag. I don't think there is any way to turn back the clock on Africa and the diseases of that continent. It's too late in many ways for that to be done. And so you begin to wonder what kind of a solution can possibly be found to a problem like that. And then you also look in some parts of the Middle East. Children have been so corrupted by hatred in their schools, their families, their homes, and every part of their lives, that the possibility of peace has been made impossible for generations to come. You can kill off the adult generation in Palestine right now, and as those children come of age, you will have them to kill as well. You know, it's really sobering to think that in the old days, one of the things that God told Israel as they came into this land, he said, I don't want you to look around you at these people and say, what were their religious customs? Why can't we just adapt these religious customs to the worship of our God? God says, don't you do that. Because everything that I hate, they have done to their gods. They have even burned their own children in the fire to their gods. So I don't want you doing that. And I thought about that, and I watch right now the people of the Middle East, in a manner of speaking, burning their own children alive to their God. They are actually sacrificing their children. Think about this. They are sacrificing their children to jihad, to holy war. Because it's children, it's young people who are doing a lot of these suicide bombings. And they're honoring and holding in great praise and honor the people who do suicide bombing, creating in young people a desire to die for Allah, to die in jihad. They have a greater desire, someone put it, to die than Americans do to live. You know, you hear that sort of thing and you really wonder, where does this go from here? Now, I don't suggest that the solution to the problem is that we would kill off man, woman, and child in the Middle East. What I'm saying is that these things give you a tiny little window into what that world at that time might have been like, to such an extent that no one could be left alive of this corrupt, heinously corrupt people that they were moving in to dispossess from the land. Archaeologists have discovered some aspects of it, but I think most of what would have been going on at the time, there's no way you would ever discover it. I know that they have found, for example, children's bones laid into the foundation, whereas the child was laid in the foundation of the gates of a city. They poured concrete around him. There's this child who was sacrificed as they built the city. Child sacrifice was common, and I given to understand that some of that child sacrifice was burned alive. And this is the religion of these people, and it will be perpetuated generation after generation after generation. And I just think that what God is telling them is they are, in some cases, not necessarily to kill all the people, but they are absolutely commanded to drive them all out of the land. Now, I don't feel that it's at all my job to justify God, explain God. God is sovereign. He could do what he wants to do. But I think we begin to get some little idea of what's going on. The scripture, by the way, is in Deuteronomy 12, verse 39, that tells you, where God tells them, I don't want you getting any of the practices of those gods and following them. Jeremiah tells of a time later in Israel's history. In Jeremiah 7:28 and verse 34. And it's something I'm going to skip ahead very slightly and tell you, that as Israel came into the land, they did not drive out the people who were there. Some of them they drove out, some of them they allowed to stay. And they did, in the course of time, adopt the customs of these people. Jeremiah 7, verse 28. You shall say to them, this is a nation that obeys not the voice of the Lord their God, nor receives correction. He's talking about Israel. Truth is perished. It's cut off from their mouth. Cut off your hair, Jerusalem, and cast it away, and take up a lamentation on high places. Excuse me. Could stop that. Take up a lamentation on high places. For the Lord has rejected and forsaken the generation of his wrath. For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, saith the Lord. They have set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to pollute it. They've taken these things right into the temple of God. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not. It never came into my mind. The implication of this is that they were actually burning their children in the fire toward God. Otherwise, I don't know why this thing, God's saying, it wasn't my idea. I didn't want that. That never crossed my mind. Why should they say they're doing it to me? But they were right down there, just south of the temple, in that little valley below, which finally came to be called Gehenna, and gave its name to hell. They were going down there, burning their sons and their daughters in the fire, a custom which they learned from guess who? The Amorites. Who else? Therefore the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no longer be called Tophet, nor the valley of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. They shall bury in Tophet, till there's no place left to bury anyone. And the carcasses of the people shall be meat for the fowls of the heaven and for the beasts of the earth, and no one shall run them off. Just a place of dead bodies and burning fires, and it will go on forever, and go on continually. This happened because the Israelites did not finally drive out all the Canaanites, but rather adopted their religious customs instead. And I want you to understand something very important here. This is not a matter of race. It is never raised in the Bible as a question of race. It is always a question of a corrupt religious system that corrupted and destroyed children. That's important. I'm going to say it again. It was not a matter of race. It was a matter of a corrupt religious system that corrupted and destroyed children. God did not want any vestige of this system remaining. He wanted the land cauterized of the infection the Amorites had brought upon it. Stern? Yeah. Tough? Oh, yeah. Now, there is a scripture, though, that I find some consolation in, and it's Deuteronomy 32:39. God says, see now that I, even I, am he, then there is no God with me. I kill, I make alive. I wound, I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand. There it is. I wound, I heal. I kill, I make alive. God is sovereign. He can do as he wishes. And even though he may kill a person, the time may yet come when God once again makes him alive. He says, I lift up my hand to heaven and I say, I live forever. If I whet my glittering sword, in my hand take hold on judgment, I will render vengeance to my enemies and reward them that hate me. Far be it from me to apologize for God. He is sovereign and his ways are right. My job is to tell you who he is, whose claim to the land might be just, and what God says about these people at the end time. You'll have to sort out your feelings of God with him in prayer. The next conquest to the north was Og, the king of Bashan, and that enabled Moses to make the first distribution of land to the children of Israel. Remember, we set out to trace titles here and to see who got what and how they got it. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 12, this land which we possessed at that time from Aroer by the river Arnon, and half of Mount Gilead and the cities thereof, I gave to the Reubenites and the Gadites. Ah, yes, here we go. Now we have the way in which Abraham's estate is being delivered to being distributed to the sons of Jacob, that is, to the 12 tribes of Israel. First to Reuben, then to Gad, the very first land they encountered on Transjordan, from the river Arnon going north on the east side of the Dead Sea. You can work your way up. Some of the Bible maps you have will actually show Reuben and Gad getting distributions of land in that area. The rest of Gilead, Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh, all the region of Argob, all Bashan, which is called the land of giants. Jair, the son of Manasseh, took all the country of Argob to the coast of Geshuri, and it's a lot of names here, called them by their own names. And I gave Gilead to Machir. To the Reubenites, the Gadites, I gave from Gilead to the river Arnon, half the valley, and the border to the river Jabbok, which is the border of the children of Ammon. So, it would appear we have found a disturbing piece of information about the title to the land we're dealing with down there. The land, even on the other side of the Jordan, where the city of Ammon is today, belongs to guess who? Israelites. So the claim to the land, the ancient claim to the land, the original land grant was given to Abraham. Now, you know, this is important to understand this. Because here in Texas, for example, a lot of our titles go back to an original Spanish land grant, where the king of Spain granted title to land to certain individuals. And to run that time forward, you can actually trace the title and the transfers of the land and the breaking up and the distribution of it all the way down to us today. The chain of title is there. The original land grant is what you have got to have to establish it. Kings had the right, going and tracing back to the divine right of kings, to grant title to lands that they discovered and that their people discovered in the course of time. We purchased the Louisiana Purchase from Spain, from France, who had claimed all of that land for the king of Spain. It was purchased by the United States, and then the United States in turn grants title to different parts of the Louisiana Purchase, and so on it goes. As governments, acting as sovereign, actually distribute title to land from the old original land grants. Where are the original land grants to the land we're talking about? God is sovereign. God had the right to grant the title to it. And guess who he gave it to? Gave it to Abraham and Abraham's descendants. And not only that, but we even have the details on how the estate was distributed in later years, as you can follow the chain of title on down to now. And what do we find? We find that Reuben, Gad, and half a tribe of Manasseh, the other half will be on the other side of Jordan, actually have title to the land that the Jordanians are sitting on today. Now, I don't know what, when you start talking about ancient title, who was there first or who had possession, as far as any historical record is concerned, the children of Israel had the right to those lands. But who are the Palestinians and what is their claim? Because there they are. They have been there a long time. And they are complaining that the Israelites, in moving into the settlements and the West Bank settlements, are encroaching on their land, and that they shouldn't be doing that, and they should back off, and the whole thing about land. Israel is supposed to give back to the Palestinians land, which they believe is theirs in the first place, in order to purchase peace. And there's something called the peace process, which is one of the most misnamed processes ever come down in the history of man. So who are they? If they are Arabs, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, well, they have no claim to the modern land of Israel. They only have the rights of possession, maybe for some years while Israel was in captivity and they moved up there and squatted on the land. They had that right, I suppose. But there's no title. And I don't know of anything in the Bible that says you can gain title to land by squatting on it for some period of time. Rather, as we might come to find later, the contrary. So, there were some long-term implications, though, of what Israel was supposed to do regarding the inhabitants of the land. We have this one other big body of people that we haven't dealt with, called Amorites, and in particular, or Canaanites in general, Amorites in particular, and some other smaller Canaanite tribes that were in this area, as well as the Amorites. Numbers 33. We'll try to deal with some of these longer-term implications. Numbers 33. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you pass over Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their pictures, destroy all their molten images, pluck down all their high places. You shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land, and you shall live there, for I have given you the land to possess it. Drive the squatters off the land. Move them out. And take over the land. It's yours. You shall divide the land by lot for an inheritance among your families. To the more you shall give more inheritance. To the fewer you shall give the less inheritance. Every man's inheritance shall be in the place where his lot falls. According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit. Now let me stop right here and explain one small thing. After Israel moved into the land, they totaled up the number of people that were in the different tribes, decided on how much land each person would get, and apparently by some means they cast lots, which would look like a random distribution to you and I. But the actual distribution of all the land on the other side of Jordan, from south to north, of all that was going to belong to Israel, was divided up by lot to the children of Israel, and they were granted perpetual ownership of that land. And one of the reasons I say perpetual, I mean, the Bible makes it clear enough that the whole land grant is a perpetual grant. But these lots, by law, were not allowed to be sold off in perpetuity. In other words, if you owned a piece of land in the land grant of Manasseh that had come down to your fathers by lot, and you had it, it belonged in your family, it was distributed that way, you could sell it up to the next Jubilee. In other words, we're 25 years into the Jubilee. You could sell a 25-year lease to that property. But that's all. The property would be, as we call it, leasehold, not freehold. So that consequently, at the end of that 25 years, the land always reverted back through the laws of inheritance to its rightful heir. And it always stayed in the family. So that even though somebody had sold it off in years gone by, God's law requires that in the Jubilee, all that land reverts back to its original family owner, whatever the chain of inheritance would be. That's where that land belongs. There were some rather complex laws that are strange to us, including even what are called the levirate laws, where a man had to take and raise up seed to his brother. The whole thing is to maintain the clean inheritance of land in all these places because these were perpetual. So now we know something more about this. We know that all that land on this side of the Jordan River from north to south belongs to the children of Israel, not somebody else. It was delivered to them by lot, by God, in perpetuity. They were not to be allowed to sell it off to anybody else for any reason. So, who owns the land? Israel does. That doesn't, of course, solve all the problems, but it does establish certain principles that people keep kicking around and arguing about from time to time. Then comes verse 55 of Numbers 33. If you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, it shall come to pass that those you let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they will vex you in the land wherein you dwell. Now, do you think you could write a better description of the situation Israel faces right now in Palestine? Thorns in your eyes, pricks in your eyes, thorns in your side, vexed in the land you dwell. No peace in your land. Why? Because you didn't drive these people out when you should have done it. Who are, then, the thorns in their side? That's the question. Why are they there? Later, just before his death, Joshua made a similar speech. Joshua 23, verse 1. It came to pass a long time after that the Lord had given rest to Israel from all her enemies, that Joshua got very old and he was stricken in age. And he called all Israel and all the elders and for their heads, their judges, and their officers and said, I'm old and stricken in age. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to those nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he that fought for you. Behold, I have divided unto you by lot these nations that remain. Now this is something long, much later, all the way down to the death of Joshua. There were still cities and everything still involved in this land that they had not dealt with at this late date. Why? How do you know? Israel was soft-hearted. Maybe they were fearful. Maybe they were afraid of joining the battle on these people. Who knows what reason it may have been. It may have been they just didn't have the heart, didn't have the guts to do what needed to be done in some of these cities. Anyway, Joshua says, I've divided it to you by lot to be an inheritance with all the nations that I have cut off from the great sea west. And the Lord your God, he shall expel them before you and drive them out from your sight, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God has promised you. Now, what this suggests that even at this late date, the conquest of the land was not complete. One important lot, well, I've already made this point about the land reverting to its owners. He then says in verse 6, be very courageous to keep and to do what's written in the book of the law of Moses, that you turn not aside to the right hand nor to the left, which implies that courage was the problem. That you come not among these nations that remain among you. You don't make mention of the name of their gods. You don't cause to swear by them. You don't serve them. You don't bow down yourselves to them. And this had to do really with a lot more than most people realize. Because when you talk about making mention of the name of their gods and swearing to them, this probably has to do with their courts. Because in their cities, in their places, if you're going to do business in their places, you're going to swear by their gods. When you stand up, if you stand up in court, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help me, God. Okay? What do you suppose that was like in a city that was owned by the Amorites? Well, this is where the problem lies in their continued relationships with these people. Cleave to the Lord your God as you have done to this day, for the Lord has driven them out from before you, great nations and strong. And nobody has been able to stand before you to this day, but you haven't dealt with all of them, is what he's implying. Take good heed to yourselves that you love the Lord your God. If you do in any wise go back, and you cleave to the remnant of these nations, even those that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they unto you, know of a certainty, the Lord your God will stop driving them out ahead of you. When you start cutting deals with them, you start making marriages. And marriages in this period of time oftentimes had to do with possession of lands, of buying lands, of, this type of thing. This is, you go and get involved in this kind of thing, and as soon as you start cutting deals, it's over. I'm not going to do it anymore for you. But they will be snares and traps and scourges and thorns until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. So how'd they do? Well, not very well. The book of Judges begins to deal with the conquest of the land after the Canaanites had been run out, or after Joshua's death. Judges chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us to fight against the Canaanites first, to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. I've delivered the land into his hand. So Judah and Simeon say, okay, Judah says, I'll make a deal. You go with me to fight for mine, and I'll go with you to fight for yours. And they went after it. Later in verse 17, Judah went with Simeon, and they slew the Canaanites at Zaphath and destroyed it. The name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah also took Gaza with the coast thereof, and Ashkelon with the coast thereof, and Ekron with the coast thereof. Heard any of those names? Who owns them? Judah, according to the ancient title. And Judah wasn't allowed to sell it off. It was given to them through the lot process forever. Now the problem begins. The Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. They gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses said, and he ran out of there 3 sons of Anak, who were giants apparently. The children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem. That had to be left for David to do many, many years later. The Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Israel to this day. Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshan or her towns. And they had all kinds of problems up there. The Canaanites would dwell in that land. Verse 28, it came to pass when Israel was strong, they put the Canaanites to tribute and did not utterly drive them out. You know what that means? It means they put them in the tax base. They started collecting taxes from them and did not drive them out of the land. Ephraim didn't drive out the Canaanites in Gezer, verse 29. Verse 30, Zebulun didn't drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Asher didn't get the job done. The Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land. They didn't drive them out. They just moved in among them and settled down among them and made marriages, cut deals, and went on down the line. Naphtali didn't do it either, and so it went. Verse 34. The Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains and wouldn't even allow them to come down into the valley. They just didn't stick to their guns and stick to their battle plan. The Amorites would dwell in Mount Heres, and the house of Joseph prevailed, so they became tributaries, and the coast of the Amorites was from the going up of Akrabim from the rock and upward. So now perhaps we know where some of Israel's problems came from. They left far too many Canaanites in the land who would, down through history, be thorns in their sides and briars in their eyes, and suicide bombers in their shopping centers and on their buses. Is that where we are? It certainly looks that way, doesn't it? There's no way to be sure after all these years who's Edom and who's Moab and who's an Amorite in that part of the world because of all the wars that have swept through there and people moving back and forth. The confusion of races must be almost totally complete. And you can't look at people and tell these things. People think they can sometimes, but you can't really. So we can't really know for sure. But what we can know, in general terms, what the source and the root of the problem really was. The source of the problem was that these land grants were given by God, official title was given to the land, and certain people were supposed to live in certain places and own the land. And they didn't follow through. They didn't take care of their business. They didn't drive out the Canaanites and take full possession of the land. And even as the years went on, because of their ongoing relationships with the Amorites in this area, the corruption of their faith became absolutely complete. It finally led to Israel being carried into captivity when they were about 220 years old. And 120 years later, the Judah went the same direction. Although Judah had done a better job in the south than the tribes in the north had at getting rid of these corrupting influences among them. And you can look back through history and kind of see what has happened. And then when you come to the Bible and the prophecies and look back into there, you will find the Bible referring to these people. And it really does make you wonder, who are they? What are they? What are they doing? And where are they going? And who owns this land legitimately? I'm afraid the record is clear. Israel owns all the disputed land in Palestine. Period. And so as far as anybody trying to make a big case, if Israel is willing to give some of that back to the Palestinians, let them live on it, somebody ought to accept that deal. Because it's, the deal that Barak offered at Camp David was a generous deal. If they had accepted that deal, had been able to accept it, and they could have gone forward, this whole thing would be over. Do you know why it's not? It's because land is not the issue. Land is not the issue. Religion is the issue. And the Palestinians will not be content until the Israelis are driven out of their own land. Very simple equation when you understand the history of it as it has come down through generation after generation after generation and understand what's really at stake here. But there's no desire to live in peace. As I said, I think many of the people have forgotten long since what the argument was really all about. Now let me show you what we're up against when we try to understand the future of the Middle East. First, I have to introduce you to a prophet. His name is Ezekiel. First time we hear of him, he is among the Jewish captives in Babylon. He was carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon about 597 BC, give or take a few years, when he was probably about 23 years old. He was a priest. He was probably 30 years old, his first year as a priest, whenever God gave him his visions that began in chapter 1 of the book of Ezekiel. He's a fascinating study from front to back, but if you don't know some things, you're not likely to really understand Ezekiel correctly. So I'm not going to start at the beginning. I'm going to take you to chapter 37, to a prophecy you may well have heard before. Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 1. The hand of the Lord was upon me. He carried me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of a valley which was full of bones. He caused me to pass by these bones round about, and there were very, very many of them in the open valley, and they were very dry. Now, don't let yourself forget for a moment as you read this passage that it is a vision. It's a nightmare. It's a bad dream. It's all a dream that he's going through. If it sounds unreal to you, you can be sure it was more unreal to Ezekiel. He said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? Ezekiel was no fool. He knew better than to guess on something like that. He knew it was a rhetorical question when he heard one. And he said, Lord, you know. And he said to me, preach upon these bones and say to them, you dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you will live. I will lay sinews upon you, and I will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. Now, I have preached to some dead audiences in my time, present company accepted, of course. But I had to feel really strange to be called upon to preach to a bunch of skeletons. Real dead people. But that's what he was supposed to do. And Ezekiel seems to have been a man who would do as he was told. So I preached as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And from this comes the spiritual song that nearly everybody's heard, right? The foot bone connected to the ankle bone connected to the leg bone, and up it goes. And whoever wrote that song got so wrapped up in the song that he really forgot to tell us what it was all about. Anyway, he says, when I beheld, lo, sinews and flesh came upon them, and skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. And he said to me, prophesy to the wind. Prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, breathe upon these slain that they may live. So I preached as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, a great army. Well, it's awesome to even think about. But again, it's a dream. It's a vision. If it's real, it would, you'd pass out, I'm sure, from the sheer fright of what happened. But in a dream, things can happen. And he preaches, and here they are. Giant army of human beings in front of him. And the spiritual song stops here and doesn't tell us where this thing goes. Then he said to me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried. Our hope is lost. We're cut off from our parts. So here it is. And there's something right here that if you don't know it, it will lead you astray, and you won't follow what Ezekiel is driving at here. Most people, when they hear Israel, think Jew. But at the time Ezekiel was given this prophecy, that's not what it meant to Ezekiel. For throughout his lifetime, the thing that was, a very large consideration, a very looming consideration in the minds of all Jews of this time, and he was not a Jew, actually, I think he was a Levite. But the fact of the matter of all the Jews, of the house of Judah, was that the house of Israel had gone captive 120 years ahead of them. There was a civil war after the death of Solomon when the tribes split. 10 tribes went to the north under Jeroboam. 3 tribes stayed in the south under the leadership of the house of Judah and under Rehoboam, Solomon's son. And that civil war, which divided them into 2 nations, just sat there and ate on them like a canker all the years of their generation of separate people. And I don't have any doubt that down through all those years, there were many, many people who prayed every day for the time to come when God would put back together again the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So there was a clear, in Ezekiel's day, there was a clear conceptualization of a distinction between the house of Judah and the house of Israel as political entities, as nations, because they had separated hundreds of years before, generations long past, and had never been united because Israel went into captivity while Judah stayed in the land. Most people know that Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, had 12 sons, and that those 12 sons formed the 12 tribes of Israel. Of these 12, Judah was the father of the Jews, and in fact, the Jews were only one of those tribes. The very first time the word Jew is used in the Bible, in fact, the Jews are at war with Israel, which kind of turns things upside down. But briefly, I've already told you basically what had happened in this particular case. So, at the time that Israel was prophesying on this, the house of Israel per se had been gone for a long time. Now, prophesy and say to them, thus saith the Lord God, behold, my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves. Now, does this sound like a resurrection to you or not? I mean, the description is inescapable. Now, I know that there is an interpretation of this section that has to do with the idea that it's a metaphor. It's symbolic of the kind of resurrection of Israel, and that it was all fulfilled when Israel came, the Israelites who had, whenever Israel fell, the house of Israel fell, there were refugees from the house of Israel in the north that made their way down to Judah and lived there for the subsequent years that were there. So you had Manassites and Ephraimites living among Judah, living in the house of Judah all those years. So when Judah went into captivity into Babylon, they went with them. And many people then assumed that when Judah came back and they came back with them, that this was all the uniting of both houses of Israel into one at this particular time. And that this is what is symbolized in the Valley of Dry Bones, is the bringing of Israel back. The problem with this is, and there are several problems with it, but let's just start with one, that the imagery that we're going to be, first of all, being asked to interpret is the Valley of Dry Bones, where you have bones lying on top of the ground, right? And the bones then get sinews, muscle, skin, and breath, and stand up, a whole great army. What does it symbolize? It symbolizes God bringing Israel up out of their graves. Why would not, if the symbolism is going back to Israel coming out of captivity, don't we start with the graves and go to that? Why do we go too removed back to bones? If you follow me, the symbolism of the bones being brought back symbolizes a resurrection from the grave. We don't normally in the Bible go 2 steps in symbolizing symbols like this. Well, you usually go symbol to reality, and I think that's what we have here, and I think that will be brought out by the remainder of the passage. You will know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, my people, and brought you up out of your graves, and shall put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I'll place you in your own land. And you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and perform it. Now, taken literally, this is talking about a resurrection from the dead, not merely a return from captivity. And while it's a vision, and it's loaded with imagery and symbolism, it's hard to know what it might mean to the house of Israel if it doesn't mean a resurrection from the dead, because a lot of them were dead. Not a whole lot of value to those that were dead, this prophecy, this bringing of Israel back. He goes on to say there, but again, there are 2 problems here. One is that the prophecy has to do not with a remnant, but with who? The whole house of Israel. So we don't really get this done, do we? Dealing merely with the refugees who fled out of Samaria down into Judah, went into captivity with the Jews, and came back out of captivity with the Jews. That doesn't get us there. Because this valley full of dry bones is the whole house of Israel. Okay? The other problem is that there are many other prophecies about a return from captivity, and there is a symbolic language for bringing people out of captivity. That's not what's used here. It is used elsewhere in Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about a return from captivity. Why do we have here a resurrection taking place if this isn't at a time when a resurrection really does take place? Sounds for all the world to me like a real resurrection, and even a resurrection to physical life. Now, whatever way we take this passage, it's very hard to see any historical fulfillment in it at all, which leads one to think it's probably future, just having come this far and no more. Now, if we go to the next part of the prophecy, which is very interesting all by itself, in verse 15, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Moreover, son of man, take a stick, write upon it for Judah, the children of Israel, his companions. You realize what he just said? Judah and the children of Israel, his companions. There were a lot of them. There were Manassites, Ephraimites, and everything else living in Judah at the time of the captivity. The house of Judah, and the term house of, as you find it in the Bible, is a term for a governmental structured entity. In other words, it is a political entity. It's not merely the children of. It is the house of, is a government. He says, Moreover, take a stick and write on it for Judah and the children of Israel, his companions. Take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, his companions. House of Judah, house of Israel. 2 sticks. Okay? Join them then to one another into one stick, and they shall become one in your hand. The implication of it is he's to put them together, and miraculously they will turn into one stick in his hand when he does so. Now, what does all this mean? For a very long time, as I said, the house of Judah and the house of Israel had been separate political entities. You've got to think about this from the time in which the prophecy was given. How did Ezekiel see it? House of Israel had gone into captivity. House of Judah was here. But the house of Israel is going to exist, and we're going to put the house of Israel, not just some scattered remnants of them, the house of Israel, a political entity called Israel, back together with a political entity called Judah. Go do this in the future. So God is apparently not finished with the house of Israel. Now remember, the valley of the dry bones was the whole house of Israel, not just a remnant of those people. When the children of Israel speak to you and say, will you show us what you mean by this? And God says, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellow. I will put them with him, even the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in my hand. Now I should say in all fairness, a lot of people believe that this is what took place when the Jews returned from Babylon. That the remnant of Israel in captivity, that went into captivity with Judah and came back, was that stick being joined. Problem? They were together before the captivity. They went into captivity, they were together afterward. The event that he's describing here is a future act from the time that he describes it. Thus saith the Lord God, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen where they are gone, and gather them on every side and bring them into their own land. What's wrong with this picture is that the Israelites who went into captivity with Judah were joined to Judah already in the past. That's not what this is talking about here. Ezekiel speaks of a future event at which time the house of Israel, not just an Israelite remnant, would be gathered in the places where they had gone, which was not where the Jews had gone. And this is fascinating. This prophecy, as I read it, has future written all over it. And so it reaches out into a time when these people are going to be brought back into the land and to possess it yet again. And why not? It's theirs. God wrote their name on the deed a very long time ago. Well, there's a lot more to this, but there's not a lot more time this afternoon. We may have to approach this again another day.